If you haven't noticed over the years, the UFC is evolving rapidly. The fighters are better than ever, and that's why in this video, we're going to be matching up the current UFC champions with their division's past legends. The first matchup we're going to be breaking down is Islam Makhachev, the lightweight champion, versus Khabib Nurmagomedov, the former lightweight champion. This is one of the most talked about matchups, and honestly, one of the hardest matchups to break down. But the thing about Islam is that he is a more complete fighter than Khabib. And if we're going to break this down on the feet first, Islam Makhachev has the clear advantage. He's gone to war with some of the most high-level strikers on the feet. The striking Islam Makhachev had with Dustin Poirier, it was basically even. Islam knocked out Volkanovski in their rematch with a head kick in the first round. Volkanovski's one of the best strikers of all time, and he knocked the guy out in the first round. Yes, I know it's on short notice, but he has a resume and experience going against some of the top guys in the world, and not just using what he's good at, which is his wrestling. He's beating some of these guys at their own game, and Khabib's never done that. Khabib's always been the fighter who just dominates people with his grappling. Islam Makhachev, he's finishing people on the feet. If this was an MMA fight without wrestling, without grappling, I think Islam Makhachev would win. I think we could all agree on that. But the reason Khabib was levels ahead of people was his grappling. I don't think Islam Makhachev has the same level of grappling Khabib has. It might be close, but Khabib has next level pressure, next level cardio. And if we compare some of their similar opponents like Dustin Poirier, Khabib had much more success taking down Poirier. He finished Poirier way earlier on the ground than Islam Makhachev could. He could secure takedowns better. It looked like he controlled Poirier much easier than Islam Makhachev did. And you can make the argument that Dustin Poirier fixed a lot of things with his grappling going into the Islam Makhachev fight. It was 5 years since his fight with Khabib. He had a lot of time to make tons of adjustments on the ground. But I think a lot of people can agree that Khabib's grappling just seems better than Islam's. And in this matchup, I think this is where it gets really close, because can Khabib hold down Islam? Can he control him on the ground? Can he get a finish? That's the really important thing, because if Khabib can't dominate Islam on the ground, or at least just hold him on the ground for most of the fight, then the fight's going to take place on the feet. And I think we all know that Islam Makhachev would beat Khabib on the feet. But I think the real decider of this fight, and why I would pick Khabib to win this fight, is because of the cardio and the pressure. I think Khabib's pressure would break Islam Makhachev eventually. I think Khabib can push harder. I think he has better cardio. We've seen Islam Makhachev get tired. We saw him get tired against Dustin Poirier. We saw him shoot labored takedowns. We saw him against Volkanovski in their first fight. He looked labored. He looked tired. We've never really seen Khabib tired to that level. Yeah, he was taking deep breaths in the Gaethje fight. He was taking deep breaths in the Conor McGregor fight, but that's because he was pushing so hard of a pace, and the other guys were even more exhausted. There were times where it looked like Dustin Poirier was more fresh than Islam Makhachev, where Volkanovski was more fresh than Islam Makhachev. I've never really seen that with Khabib. I've never seen a fighter look like he was in better condition than Khabib. And I think that if they fought, I think Khabib would pressure wrestle so heavily that even if he didn't score a takedown or hold Islam Makhachev down for, a period of time, I think this fight would turn into non-stop wrestling exchanges. That's what I think would happen. I don't think Islam could keep range and pick Khabib apart without having to defend takedowns. And I think Khabib would gas out Islam Makhachev. And I think Khabib's taken this one. But this is a hard one to pick because Islam Makhachev right now, most people consider him lightweight GOAT. He's fought more opponents. He's had great wins. He's defended his belt more than Khabib. But I still think just, styles make fights, and Khabib would take this one home. But now we're moving up to light heavyweight. Current champion Magomed Ankalaev is looking unstoppable right now. He just beat Alex Pereira by decision, and going into the rematch, most people are picking Magomed to win again. But how does he fare against the light heavyweight division's GOAT, Jon Jones? That's the next matchup we're going to be talking about, and this is a difficult one because, a lot of people, if they're asked this, they're just going to automatically say Jon Jones. Jon Jones is the GOAT. He's the best. He dominated for years. But let's break this down unbiasedly. MMA is evolving. And Jon Jones' last fights at light heavyweight were not that impressive. Let's be real. He lost to Dominic Reyes. He got a robbery win. He had a lackluster fight with Anthony Smith and Thiago Santos. Very timid, very slow paced. And that's what a lot of people would consider a prime age Jon Jones. He was not very old in those fights. But let's break down the actual matchup. I think Magomed Ankalaev would actually beat Jon Jones on the feet. He has that pressure boxing, kind of similar to Dominic Reyes. And we all know Jon Jones struggles with that boxing, right? Every time someone presses him with solid combinations and is, similar height to him where he can't just lean back and avoid it, he starts to run. He starts to turn his head and almost run parallel to the cage, kind of like how Chandler did against Charles Oliveira. And I think if Jon Jones just stayed on the feet and tried to pick Ankalaev apart, I don't think that would work. I think Ankalaev would actually control the space. I think he would put Jon on the back foot. But we all know Jon Jones is known not just for his fighting skill, but for his fight IQ. And I think Jon would try to immediately take this fight to the ground. And that's why I think Jon Jones would win this matchup eventually, because I think we all know Jones's levels ahead of Ankalaev on the ground. Ankalaev's not a grappler. Okay, he's well-rounded, but he's not a grappling specialist like how Khabib and Islam Makhachev are, even though they're from the same area. Ankalaev's not that skilled on the ground. And I think Jon Jones would take this fight to the ground eventually and get a submission. I think the submission is really where, Jon Jones would excel. We've seen Ankalaev lose by submission before. And I think the jiu-jitsu of Jon Jones and the top control would be really hard for Ankalaev to stop. But again, maybe not. Maybe Ankalaev could stuff all the takedowns of Jon Jones. We've seen Dominic Reyes stuff majority of the takedowns from Jon Jones. But the difference is that Jon Jones tried to strike with Reyes for the first 3 rounds. I think Ankalaev is a much more dangerous threat than Dominic Reyes on the feet. And I think once Jon Jones realizes that pretty soon, he would go for the takedown. And I think Jon Jones would win by submission in the 3rd or 4th round. But let's go one division down to middleweight, where the current champion, Dricus du Plessis, could cement himself as middleweight GOAT if he gets a win against Khamzat or a couple more wins after that. He's taken down guys like Adesanya. He's beat Sean Strickland twice, which is a legit contender. He beat a legend like Robert Whittaker. You can say what you want about his style, but this guy is high level. But we all know who the middleweight GOAT is. It's Anderson Silva, and how would Dricus fare against Anderson Silva? This is an interesting one because I think this fight can go 2 different ways. And I think the way it goes, if Dricus wins this fight, he's too big for Anderson Silva. He has too much pressure for Anderson Silva. He's too strong. He takes Silva down and he batters him on the ground. We've seen guys like Chael Sonnen do this in their first fight. Yes, he didn't win, but the entire fight, he took down Anderson Silva and dominated him on the ground. That's Chael Sonnen. What about Dricus du Plessis, a legit champion who's defended his belt, who's much bigger than Chael Sonnen? What does he do to Anderson Silva on the ground? Du Plessis has crazy pressure. Du Plessis has a crazy chin. The way Du Plessis wins, it would be a dominant one. It would be pressuring Anderson Silva, holding him on the ground, beating him on the ground, maybe eventually choking him out. Anderson Silva has good jiu-jitsu, but I don't think Du Plessis would fall for the same trap Chael Sonnen did, which is a triangle off his back. How often do you see in modern MMA now someone getting a submission off their back? It's very rare. Most submissions come off of a top position, and I don't think Du Plessis would get choked out in that circumstance. But there's also another reality, which is Du Plessis has a very unorthodox style, and Anderson Silva is one of the most legendary strikers of all time. He has crazy knockout power. He has crazy head movement. His timing's perfect. I think there's a possibility Dricus goes in there and tries to charge Anderson Silva like he does every opponent, blitz forward, and Anderson Silva just pulls back and counters and makes Du Plessis look stupid, because there is a chance. I think eventually a high-level striker who can counter great could do that to Du Plessis, because as much as a threat Du Plessis is and how good he's been doing against some opponents, I think that kind of loose charging forward style can be exposed. And if anybody was to do it, I think it would be a prime Anderson Silva. But I think the chance of that happening is lower than the chance of Du Plessis taking Anderson Silva down, pressuring him, exhausting him, and landing ground and pound. And I think, honestly, this is the first time I'm picking a current champion. I'm picking Du Plessis to beat Anderson Silva, prime Anderson Silva. But now we go up to heavyweight. And yes, Jon Jones is the current champion as recording this video. But I think we all know the real champion is Tom Aspinall. So we're going to compare the current champion, Tom Aspinall, to heavyweight GOAT Stipe Miocic. How does this fight go down? And I'm going to cut this one short. I think it's Tom Aspinall. I really don't see a world where even a prime Stipe beats Tom Aspinall. And that's, no hate against Stipe, but Tom Aspinall is this new breed of heavyweight. He really is. We haven't seen heavyweights like this in the UFC, really, other than Jon Jones. We all know the rest of the UFC heavyweight division is mostly just fat slobs who are not the same level as the other divisions. They're just not. It's clear as day. Aspinall's the new breed of the good UFC heavyweights. He takes it to another level. And I just don't see an area where Stipe could expose or beat Tom Aspinall at. And I think Aspinall would finish Stipe Miocic in the 1st or 2nd round. And it's not that Stipe's a bad fighter. He's the heavyweight GOAT. But, when Tom Aspinall wins fights, he wins him by the first round or the second round, early finishes. And I think that's what would happen to Stipe Miocic. I think Aspinall, he's too big, he's too long, he has too much power, and I think he would finish Stipe Miocic in the first round. But one of the most talked about divisions right now and the most stacked divisions right now is welterweight. And we just recently had a new champion, Jack Della Maddalena, and we all know who the welterweight GOAT is. There's no debate at all. It's George St. Pierre. How would these two fighters match up? Part of me just wants to say GSP and not even think about it because of how high level this guy was, especially for back in his time. And JDM is just the new guy. He's had no title defenses. We haven't seen that much from him. But let's look at the actual matchup between them. JDM has some of the best boxing in welterweight right now. He completely outboxed Belal Muhammad, but in a fight with George St. Pierre, he could possibly have the advantage on the feet. But the reason I think we all know that GSP would win this fight is because of GSP's wrestling, because of his takedowns. As good as Belal Muhammad is on the ground and his pressure, he's no George St. Pierre when it comes to takedowns, when it comes to his level of jiu-jitsu, his grappling, his control. I think GSP would take JDM down and dominate him on the ground. I think he would submit him. I think he would elbow him. I think he would cut him open. But now we move to featherweight, and Volkanovski is champion once again, and most people consider this guy the featherweight GOAT. He beat Max Holloway 3 times in his prime. He did beat Jose Aldo, and that's who we're matching Alexander Volkanovski against, is Jose Aldo, because the other debate for featherweight GOAT is Jose Aldo. And even though Volkanovski beat Aldo, that wasn't necessarily a prime Jose Aldo, but nonetheless, I still think Volkanovski would win, and it's just because of Volkanovski is one of the greatest fighters of all time. And, you know, I think in this matchup, the biggest difference would probably be the physicality. Volk is a lot bigger than Aldo. The reach of Volkanovski, in addition to just his insane skill level, I think would be too much for Aldo to handle. Aldo was able to cut down to 135. Volkanovski could never cut down to 135 pounds. They're just not the same size. And when you have two fighters as high level as this, sometimes it just comes down to the physical attributes of these fighters. And also, I think Volkanovski is just more skilled than Jose Aldo in general. So I'm picking Volkanovski to win this one, and I think Volk probably takes this one home by decision or a late round finish. And down one division, we have the bantamweight GOAT and the current champion, Merab Dvalishvili. The only legend some people might still consider GOAT is Dominic Cruz, and this is one that just wouldn't take much time. Yes, Dominic Cruz is a very skilled champion, especially for the time that he fought in, but Merab is just next level. His cardio is really next level, and I think he would bulldoze Dominic Cruz, and I think Cruz would just get exhausted and tired out, and I think Merab would win this one over decision. And I don't think this one's really close. I think this is one of the most, decisive wins on here. But the last matchup we have is Alessandro Pantoja versus Demetrius Johnson. Pantoja's the current champion, but everybody knows that Demetrius Johnson is the flyweight GOAT, but maybe not for long, because Pantoja really is completely dominating his division. He's almost running out of people to fight. I think if he gets, a handful of wins, maybe 3 or more wins and good dominant wins at flyweight, he could be up there with Demetrius Johnson, or he could surpass Demetrius Johnson. And the big difference between these guys in terms of resume is that, if we're being honest, Demetrius Johnson's opponents were not the highest level, and you can't put that against Demetrius Johnson, but it's always been one of the least stacked divisions in the UFC. It still is now, but flyweights have gotten a lot better, and there's a lot of very high level flyweights in the UFC now that Pantoja has beaten. So I think this would be a close fight, and it's mostly because I think Pantoja has a huge physicality advantage. I think he's bigger than Demetrius Johnson. I think he's tougher and more durable. There is a chance he could just pressure Demetrius Johnson and get into a slugfest and make the fight ugly and win. But I think it's more likely that Demetrius Johnson just completely outclasses Pantoja on the feet and on the ground. I think Demetrius Johnson in general is just more skilled in every department than Pantoja. And for those reasons, I think Demetrius Johnson would win this one. But this is a really interesting matchup that, could go either way. I really do think that Pantoja does have a chance in this fight. But I just think the skill level of, Demetrius Johnson is too much for Pantoja to handle if this fight went down. But those are the current champions versus their division's legends. But if you guys like this video, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.